We're now less than 3 weeks away from the return of Verdansk to Warzone on April the 3rd, but new leaks have just revealed some rather big gameplay changes that could have a big impact, and potentially a fan-favourite vehicle could be returning. If you want to stay updated on all things Verdansk when it drops, including news, updates, patch notes, loadout videos, and more, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. And if you're excited for Verdansk to return, hit that like button, and in the comments section, tell me where you're going to drop first. Okay, let's start things off. All of these leaks are worth taking with a grain of salt, as always. Until we see the final product on April 3rd, we cannot be 100% certain that everything will be as it is stated here. That said, the information today is coming from Ghost of Hope, someone who's had a great success rate in the past. Right now, it is being stated that Verdansk, despite being built on an engine version that does support it, will not have player-accessible water and swimming mechanics, marking a significant change in gameplay approach going all the way back to the introduction of the feature in Warzone 2 and the launch of the Al Mazrah map. Now, on paper, having swimmable water makes sense, especially on a map like Verdansk, which has a huge coastline. And I remember back in the original Warzone days, players used to mention all the time how it was kind of annoying that as soon as you touched the water, you'd be killed because the game didn't have any swimming mechanics back then. It limited flanking opportunities along the coastline as well, with plenty of end zone locations happening down there on the south of the map. However, in practice, I think we're going to see this change, this reversion back to original Warzone settings, as an overall positive for Warzone. Without large bodies of water to think about, players won't have to deal with frustrating underwater gunfights, which is basically what happened every single time. Enemies would hide in those hard-to-see areas, or they would just simply sit just below the water at different angles so you couldn't see them, and you'd get those awkward movement transitions between leaving the water, coming back out on the land again, and then not being able to react as quickly as you like. Underwater fights in Warzone are still limited to pistols only, and the ballistics of the bullets are massively impacted by the water as well. It's been something that players have actually asked to be changed for a while, maybe just allowing primary weapons to be used underwater to make gameplay more interesting, but that's never been something that the developers have actually entertained. So by removing underwater combat, we're going to see a more consistent gunfight experience, keeping engagements predictable and skill-based rather than relying on cheesy underwater-based tactics. And don't forget, shooting into water also impacts bullets, so your guns don't perform the same way. So this is going to remove another frustrating element that Warzone 2.0 introduced a few years ago. And also, Verdansk's urban and mountainous terrain and almost complete lack of areas that contain water perhaps drove this change more so than anything else. The dam area and the river that runs all the way through the map, they are completely frozen in the 2020 version of Verdansk, and that's what we're getting back. So maybe that's what drove the change. Verdansk, I personally feel, thrived on grounded combat and solid gunplay, where players were using natural and more structured cover. By not having water-based combat, players can expect more readable gunfights and predictable rotations, rather than enemies just using water as a cheesy escape tool. Removing swimming also speeds up map rotations. It ensures fights are more fluid without players stalling underwater and avoiding battles that they'd otherwise have to take. Ultimately, this change should make Verdansk a smoother experience when it comes to movement and rotation across the map. Okay, moving on to leak number 2 now, but actually sticking with the final point of leak number 1, rotations, let's talk about vehicles. This is something I've mentioned a few times on stream and in a couple of videos in the last week or so, about how since Verdansk disappeared and was succeeded by Warzone 2.0, vehicles just took a massive L and became vastly deprioritized in the gameplay loop, to the point where during Warzone 2.0 on Al Mazrah, players just barely touched them. They accelerated extremely slowly, they took ages to reach their top speed, and they adopted realistic, or maybe I should say authentic, handling, taking them to the opposite end of the vehicle spectrum from what they were like during 2020 and 2021, where I'd say they were quite arcadey, but really just fun to use. Now, according to Ghost of Hope, Warzone will see a huge improvement to vehicles and their handling when Verdansk launches with Season 3. He states that while it won't be a direct one-to-one with the original settings we had back in Verdansk during 2020, there will be settings closer to what that is than they are currently, and they will be further improved and applied to the vehicles over the course of the next year, even after Season 3, so they get as close as possible to the gameplay that we saw at the beginning of Warzone. Now this, I think, is a huge win for players. Let me tell you why. I think it's a key part of achieving something close to the OG Warzone feeling. Vehicles becoming far more powerful tools for movement and rotation on Verdansk, contributing to that grounded combat feeling that we've lost largely since Verdansk was taken away in 2021. Around that time, devs introduced redeploy balloons into the Battle Royale mode, something that they took from Resurgence, and they have largely replaced the role of vehicles ever since. However, that introduction was also a contributing factor to the rise in less grounded gameplay, with rotations across the map being dominated by teams that utilize the balloons, or the drones as they are in Black Ops 6, landing on the heads of opposing teams and destroying them before they even had a chance to react. Vehicles directly combat that gameplay type by keeping players grounded and allowing them to rotate across open ground, whilst also presenting those players as a larger target for enemies in the area to shoot at. We all remember how a well-placed C4 or a well-placed RPG shot against the SUVs would result in a pretty satisfying multi-kill back on Verdansk. It was a pretty cool moment in the game if you ever got one. But on the other side of the coin, a prepared team could rotate across the map safely by skirting the edge of the zone. They could try and avoid enemy teams and potentially gain a powerful position in the next zone, all whilst being in danger of attack because the vehicle itself is a larger overall target. I think vehicles just made gameplay more predictable in general. We got more genuine gunfights on the ground around these powerful areas of the map as a result, instead of teams just taking to the skies and landing on the heads of others, leaving them with no time to react whatsoever. So the return of this classic balancing to vehicles in Verdansk should make the map feel more fluid, more tactical, and of course true to its original identity. Now, leak number 3, I think, is a pretty big one. Sticking with vehicles as a theme, I think you saw this in the thumbnail, there's a chance the original big Bertha trucks return to Verdansk, according to Ghost of Hope. He says in his post that this one should be taken with a grain of salt, as should all leaks, but maybe if the person leaking the information is telling you that, you should take a little bit more care with this one. If the Berthas do return, they could well wreak havoc with the balancing of vehicles again, as admittedly, they were extremely powerful back in the day. They were the ultimate vehicle for squads to move across open areas, they would tank huge amounts of damage from enemy players, and they could even provide a moving piece of cover if a skilled driver could stop themselves from being shot in the head. They were a menace for players to deal with, unless those players were equipped with explosive weapons like launchers and C4s, which were common in the earlier Verdansk days, but less so over time. But I do remember their power being handled effectively in an update where the developers enabled despawning of those vehicles later on in matches, so they couldn't be used in the final circles as battering rams and bullet sponges. That used to be a major issue in Warzone Solo. So many times you'd be driving around in the final circle, just running people over. It never felt very fair. So when they changed that, although I was a little bit sad because I could always guarantee kills in the final circle, it obviously was for balancing reasons. So if these legendary beasts do return, I hope it's with the same balancing as we saw them leave Warzone with. There's a potential for them to be too powerful, but I'm hoping the developers have already realized that. So if they do end up in the game, they end up as a balanced addition to the game. And lastly for today, we have another potential OG weapon returning to Verdansk, the Grau. This originally launched as a Season 2 weapon in Modern Warfare 2019, and it also took on the role as one of the most powerful and most complained about weapons in Warzone's history. This thing had such little recoil, really steady damage output, pretty high rate of fire, and it could be equipped with a 60-round mag. So arguably, you could say that the Grau set the standard for all future meta weapons in Warzone's history. So many other weapons that became meta in the future mimicked this original setup in some way, but one added bonus that the Grau had over them, on certain weapon blueprints anyway, were some of the cleanest iron sights we ever had in Warzone. We had this single, very thin middle post in an overall low-profile optic, and they were great to use at medium to long range, and essentially, that freed up the optic attachment that most people would use on their assault rifles to be used on something else, giving the Grau a huge advantage over other weapons that you could use, but the ones that just didn't have great iron sights. You'd always have to use an optic with other assault rifles. With the Grau, you didn't have to. So whether we see that return in Warzone again does remain to be seen, but the Ghost of Hope is reporting that the Grau may return in Season 3 Reloaded, the mid-season update, probably a few weeks after Verdansk's launch, or Season 4. And of those two options, I'd like Season 4 personally. It'd give players more time, maybe an entire season of fun with the other returning weapons that we already know about, the Kilo, the HDR, and the AMAX. So I've got to say, if these leaks do turn out to be true, they are painting a rather promising picture for Warzone's most iconic map returning, bringing back fan-favourite mechanics whilst refining gameplay for a better overall experience. From removing swimming for more consistent combat to reverting vehicle balancing for smoother rotations and better positioning across the map, these changes could make Verdansk feel both nostalgic and refreshed at the same time. I'm hoping for a lot of things here, but it's really dependent on how it's executed out by the developers. I personally think if we see gameplay return to being more grounded, without redeploy balloons, with vehicles buffed and fun to use again, we're already onto a winner. As we get closer to April 3rd, more details surrounding Verdansk will likely emerge, official and potentially more leaked ones, but one thing is absolutely clear. Verdansk's return is shaping up to be a monumental moment for Warzone. It could be a positively monumental moment, or a negatively monumental moment, and as I said, that is entirely dependent on how this is executed from the development team. Thanks very much for watching. Make sure you subscribe for all my coverage of the map when it drops, and why not check out this video, by the way, of some unanswered questions that we still have for Verdansk's return. I think there's 7 in there that you can listen to. I'll catch you in the next one.